Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something complex, something deeply necessary. Our focus is that difficult, tangled struggle over identity, state formation, and, well, privilege in Myanmar, or Burma, as many still know it. The sources you've pulled together are incredibly rich, really spanning everything from ancient kingship right up to modern activist critiques.
Yeah, this is a crucial conversation, I think, because it pushes beyond just the headlines. Our sources, they repeatedly stress the need for what you might call historical thinking, not just, memorizing dates and names, but cultivating discernment, judgment, caution, understanding that historical texts aren't just facts on a page, they're what one text calls speech acts, they have motives.
Speech acts. That's a really powerful frame. So every historical text, every law, maybe even every census record we look at, it reflects the intention, the social context of whoever created it. And understanding Myanmar means seeing these sources as, well, actions designed to shape or reinforce power.
Exactly. And that leads us right into the mission for you, listening in. The goal here is to really analytically engage with this difficult history of power struggles. We need to move beyond the surface narratives, to really grasp the operational meanings behind terms like Burman privilege or this concept of Kayapars, the mixed bloods, and the, frankly, non-negotiable federal aspirations of many ethnic minorities.
Okay, so at the heart of it all is this fundamental tension, isn't it? Between how the majority, the Bamar, and various minorities envision the country's future. On one side, you've got these ethnic minority groups who are, in essence, imagining nations first, which then need to create their own states, the nation-first idea.
That's right. While on the other side, you have the Bamar majority. Their history, their dominance, it's deeply intertwined with the central state machinery. For them, identity formation often works the other way around. The state creates the nation. They tend to operate, as James C. Scott might put it, by seeing like a state, prioritizing the continuation of that centralized structure.
That distinction, nation creates state versus state creates nation, that sounds like the core collision point we need to unpack.
Yeah.
Because it implies their interests aren't just different, they might be fundamentally opposed.
That's exactly what the sources suggest, a head-on collision of interests. So to understand the modern state, the centralized power we see today, we really have to grasp how the pre-colonial state operated. It defined its power very differently from, say, the Western idea of sovereignty over a fixed piece of land.
Right, this takes us into that whole Southeast Asian mandala system concept. And the sources really highlight this critical political distinction in Burmese kingship. The title the king claimed wasn't about land, it was Narapati.
Narapati, Lord of Men. And that's a stark contrast, isn't it, to maybe Indonesian or Javanese polities where rulers often used Bupati, Lord of Land.
Okay, but why does that difference in title matter so much in practice? What does it mean for governing?
Well, think about it. If you're the Lord of Land, your power is geographically fixed. It stops where the map stops, essentially. Your main job is drawing borders, defending territory. But if you're the Lord of Men...
Your power follows the people wherever they go.
Precisely. It dictates a focus on what Foucault might later call governmentality, the techniques of controlling people, managing populations, rather than just controlling terrain.
And if your power is based on people, you absolutely need to know who they are, where they are, what they owe you, right? Which brings us to the census. It becomes this key technology of governance. Counting people becomes a kind of, well, as one source notes, drawing on Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, counting itself is a form of colonization, a way of claiming and ordering.
Exactly. It's about making the population legible to the state. The sources detail these royal orders, some records apparently going way back to the Fadaminbia era. And these weren't about citizenship in our modern sense. They meticulously categorized people into 101 distinct groups.
101 categories. That's just an astonishing level of detail for a pre-modern state.
So it wasn't really about ethnicity as we think of it now, but more like a giant state spreadsheet, assigning people to roles and obligations.
It was the king's operational database, determining who belonged to which ASU, which service group or unit. It was all about control and extraction. This ties into that concept of legibility from James C. Scott. The state always desires to simplify, abstract, measure its subjects so it can manage them efficiently, tax them, conscript them. If the state can't count you, it can't really govern you effectively in this model.
And this drive for legibility, for control over people, it leads us to another crucial relationship. The one between the palace, the Nanda, and the Buddhist Sangha, the monastery, or Kwangda.
Yes, this nexus is fundamental to understanding the stability, or maybe the specific kind of stability, of the Burmese state structure over centuries. It's quite different from, say, the European model, where you often had a powerful institutional church that could and did challenge the monarchy. And the difference comes down to Buddhist doctrine, specifically anatta, the concept of non-self.
That seems to be a key factor, yes. Because the doctrine emphasizes the impermanence of the individual self, it acted as a kind of theological break. It seems to have prevented the mumps, the Sangha, from establishing a really strong, centralized, power-seeking institution with its own distinct, everlasting corporate identity that could stand apart from the state.
So if the monks can't really coalesce into a single permanent political entity, a separate church, in the European sense, they can't mount an effective, unified opposition to the king.
That's the argument. It allowed the king to maintain control over the Sangha, preventing a theocracy like you might see in Tibet, for example. The king cemented his place as number 2 in the cosmic order, right after the Buddha, who, conveniently for the king, is permanently gone from the earthly realm.
And the sources suggest monarchy was quite savvy about maintaining this control, using things like economic incentives.
Oh, absolutely. Very clever political maneuvering. Kings would offer tax exemptions for building pagodas. So individuals or communities could gain financial or social advantage by investing in this kind of decentralized spiritual infrastructure. It's almost like that Tom Sawyer analogy, tricking people into whitewashing the fence. The king encourages this spiritual focus, which simultaneously creates pockets of land associated with monasteries that fall outside the direct state tax structure.
That's fascinating. So it encourages a kind of spiritual market, decentralized, while keeping the Siam from unifying politically. And what was the broader political consequence of that focus?
Well, one interpretation is that it inadvertently minimized the development of a certain kind of political nationalism specifically, one based on constantly fighting external enemies. The state's energy was directed more inward towards organizing and governing its own people rather than obsessively defending rigid borders against foreign threats, which might have forged a different kind of national identity earlier on. Hashtag 1.2, the marginalization of specific groups. Statelessness. Now, this inward focus on governing people also leads directly to another key concept: intentional historical marginalization, where certain groups were perhaps valued for specific skills or services, but deliberately kept outside the core state structure, denied full belonging. And the Karen people offer a really stark, quite devastating example of this.
The Karens were crucial, weren't they? Particularly for their expertise with elephants. Elephant warfare was basically the heavy artillery of the era, essential for any major kingdom's military campaigns.
Absolutely essential. Yet despite this critical role, the sources emphasize that 3 major kingdoms, the Burmese, the Mon, and the Siamese Ayutthaya, seem to have collectively and intentionally marginalized the Karen. They were viewed as existing somehow outside the main state structures.
Why would all 3 rivals do that? Was it pure prejudice, or was there strategic logic?
It looks much more like strategic calculation. Imagine, if you have 3 rival kingdoms and they all need the Karen's elephants and expertise, but each fears one rival gaining exclusive control over that resource. What's the safest strategy for all 3? It's to keep the Karen in a kind of buffer zone, a neutral resource pool, to ensure they remain, as one source puts it, equal citizens of no state. This effectively prevented the Karen from consolidating the social and political status needed to form their own independent state-like entity.
Equal citizens of no state. That phrase is just chillingly effective. It really sets a historical precedent for statelessness, doesn't it? It reminds me of how the British later used certain groups, like the Gurkhas, labeling them a martial race, valuable for fighting, indispensable even, but politically kept separate from the core structures of power.
It's a similar logic, and this kind of deliberate historical statelessness, it compounds over time. It creates the conditions where centuries later you see groups like the Rohingya facing rejection from multiple states, lacking any political home. The pattern has deep roots.
It's crucial, though, isn't it, not to paint the dominant group, the Bamar, as some kind of historical monolith either. Even back then, there were significant regional differences within the Bamar identity itself, which complicates this whole narrative of privilege.
Oh, absolutely. The sources point to a really important split between the Anafa, the upper landers from the drier, core regions around the capitals, and the Aksa, the lower landers from the Irrawaddy Delta and coastal areas. These identities developed differently, one shaped more by the king's centralized political agency, the other more by riverine trade, commerce, and interaction with the outside world. So even the core Bamar identity is complex and regionally contested, which makes the later imposition of a single unified Bamar state vision even more problematic and, frankly, artificial.
Okay, so you have this pre-colonial system focused on people, complex categories, strategic marginalization, and then the British arrive in the 19th century. And that just throws everything to disarray, doesn't it? The colonial power needed a different kind of efficiency, a different way to rule.
Completely changed the game. The British needed administrators, intermediaries. They couldn't govern this vast, incredibly diverse territory directly. So what did they do? They effectively elevated the Bamar identity, making it the local co-hegemonic power. The Bamar majority became the primary local collaborators within the colonial governance structure, and that single act immediately formalized and hardened the hierarchical relationship between the Bamar and the various ethnic minorities in a new state-sanctioned way.
And this shift, this elevation, it really acts as a catalyst for the process we now call Burmanization. Now, most people probably associate that term with the military regime after 1962, right? Robert Holmes used it in 67 to describe the policy of clearing out foreign influences, Western, Chinese, Indian. But the sources show this idea, this policy, it actually goes back further.
That's right. It wasn't invented by Noah Wynn in 62. There's evidence, internal government guidance found in the National Archives apparently, showing the term Burmanization being used in domestic policy documents as far back as the Japanese occupation era in 1943. So it was already an established concept, this push for cultural, linguistic, literary purity, well before the military formally took over.
And this drive for a kind of pure Burmese identity, it immediately runs up against the actual reality on the ground, which was much more mixed. I mean, even as early as 1905, observers like Robert Talbot Kelly were predicting that the pure Burmese would inevitably disappear. They'd be replaced, he thought, by Kayapars, these people of mixed ethnicity who would adopt the Burmese language and culture as the dominant form. Hashtag tag 2.2, the rise of the Kayapar and social mobility.
Yeah, the term Kayapar just means mixed ethnicity, basically. But in the political context of Myanmar, it carries huge significance. The rise of the Kayapar really highlights how assimilation became, for many, the key strategy for survival, for success, for moving up in the world. And here, we need to make a distinction inspired by some of the thinking from scholars like Tharamu Nameu on the Union of the Unwilling. We need to talk about willing versus unwilling Burmanization.
Okay, so the first type is what you call self-Burmanization of the willing.
Exactly. This describes individuals who came from mixed backgrounds. Maybe they had Chinese, Peo, Mon, Shan, Karen ancestry, mixed with Bamar heritage, and they made a conscious political and social choice. They chose to adopt the Bamar identity, the language, the cultural norms.
And why would they make that choice? What was the incentive?
Well, it was often the clearest, maybe the only path to upward social mobility. It was the way to gain access to elite status within both the colonial and the post-colonial state structures. Because many Kayapars, perhaps through connections to colonial administration, mission schools, or trade networks, often had better access to the kind of education needed for bureaucracy, for military leadership, for the professions.
So paradoxically, perhaps, the very architects of the later military nationalist state, the ones pushing the hardest for a unified Bamar identity, were often people who had successfully self-Burmanized. They became the gatekeepers.
The examples are really striking when you look at them. Think about Yu Pei Mong Tin. He was a Kayapar Karen, Bamar, and Anglican Christian background. He becomes the founder of modern Burmese literature, the very first Burmese professor at Rangoon University. And crucially, he translates Pali Buddhist texts into English. So he uses his hybrid position to connect Bamar culture to global scholarship, effectively boosting the cultural legitimacy of this emerging Bamar-centric elite.
That's a powerful example. And there are others, like U Razak.
U Razak, yes. A prominent Bama Muslim leader. He was instrumental in founding Mandalay University, and he actively promoted this specific Bama Muslim identity back in the 1920s and 30s. It shows that even for religious minorities, aligning politically with the dominant Bamar narrative was often seen as necessary for influence and acceptance.
And then there's the military figure, Bolet Ya.
Bolet Ya, also known as Ong Ji later on, a fascinating case. He was reportedly a Chinese Kayapar, even educated for a time by the Chinese Communist Party. Yet he completely transforms himself into a true Bama Thakin, a nationalist leader. He becomes a key general, one of the co-architects of the military regime that followed independence. These figures, often technically outsiders by ancestry, ended up enforcing some of the most stringent versions of Burmanization. Perhaps you could argue to prove their own loyalty, to secure their own class position within the new hierarchy. Their identity might have been hybrid, but their political project became intensely assimilationist.
Okay, Fast forward to the period after the 2021 coup. We're seeing, according to these sources, a really profound kind of intellectual reckoning taking place, particularly among younger activists, scholars, people within the democracy movement itself, focusing on this concept of Bamar privilege. They're drawing analogies, it seems, from discussions around whiteness privilege elsewhere, applying it to the Myanmar context, defining these often invisible benefits that come with belonging to the dominant ethnic group.
Yes, and what's striking is the specificity of how activists are defining it now. It's not just some vague abstract concept. Bamar privilege is being defined as, the luxury of not having to flee war zones as frequently or not facing routine discrimination based on your name or how you look. It means having relatively easy access to basic things like national ID cards, which can be a huge struggle for minorities.
It means the whole infrastructure of the state, the courts, the schools, the government offices, it's basically designed with you in mind by default. It means you can use your mother tongue Burmese freely in education and government without anyone questioning it. It means controlling the mainstream historical narrative, having your religion implicitly centered, having your national rights essentially guaranteed within the existing constitutional framework, even if flawed.
That's the critical point. For the Bamar, these things are often just the assumed baseline. For ethnic minorities, achieving those same rights like mother tongue education, like meaningful self-determination, requires decades of political struggle, immense cost, and often, tragically, violence. It's not the default setting at all.
But the sources also introduce a really important economic critique here, don't they? A caution against focusing only on the ethnic dimension of privilege.
They do, and it's crucial. This critique argues, quite forcefully, that the political ruling classes, and look, this includes the Tatmadaw, but also some ethnic armed organization leaders and established political party figures, have consistently, historically failed to address the core underlying issues. Issues of class difference, deep-seated poverty, and just raw economic exploitation that cut across ethnic lines.
So if we connect this back to those Kayapars we were talking about, the ones who rose in the 80s and 90s, the argument is that the opening of the markets after 1988 allowed a new elite, often connected to the military, or those who had successfully assimilated to amass huge wealth. By exploiting resources, timber, jade, gas, whatever, often located in ethnic minority regions, but benefiting this narrow class.
Exactly, and that exploitation didn't necessarily stop at ethnic borders. Impoverished Bamar villagers in central Burma could be exploited by these systems just as much as, say, Kachin miners or Karen farmers. So the argument goes, by allowing this privileged debate to constantly dominate the national conversation, the ruling elite across different factions effectively distracts the broader population, the working poor, from recognizing their shared economic enemy, which is the exploitative political economic system itself, run by a narrow class. It prevents genuine working class solidarity from forming across those ethnic divides. Hashtag tag 3.2, the proposed Bamar state, and the response.
Okay, so given this intense, complex struggle over identity, privilege, economics, a really fascinating and probably quite contentious proposal has emerged recently. The idea that maybe the Bamar majority should just consolidate their own ethnic state as a way to resolve this intractable national identity conflict.
Right. This proposal really throws what one source calls the inconvenient truth into sharp focus. It brings us right back to that fundamental difference in how nationalism is conceived. Remember, the minority groups tend to think the nation exists first, it's inherent, and it needs to create a state to protect its sovereignty.
Nation creates state. Got it. Whereas the Bamar identity, historically and politically, is almost inseparable from the central state apparatus itself. Their nationalism derives from the state. They think like the state, as seeing like a state, which guarantees that collision we talked about.
It does, because if the Bamar majority primarily identifies with the state as an entity, then any nation-building process they lead, whether consciously or just by default, is almost certainly going to be based on Bamar identity, Bamar language, Bamar cultural norms. Even if they create a federal structure on paper, if the underlying logic, the operating system of the state, remains Bamar-centric, then Burmanization, willing or unwilling, is likely to continue.
You mentioned earlier, though, that even Bamar identity isn't monolithic, that Anyatha versus Oktha split.
Yeah.
If the Bamar majority itself is internally complex and maybe even divided, how can they successfully impose a single unified state vision onto dozens of other ethnic groups? Isn't that internal contradiction a major weakness for, say, the Tatmadaw's project?
Oh, it's a huge weakness, a critical one. The Tatmadaw constantly tries to project this image of a rigid, unified, historically pure Bamar identity that frankly doesn't reflect the lived reality of many Bamar people themselves. But That rigid projection serves a vital political function for them. It provides a simple, clear definition of who belongs and who doesn't. That clarity, that simplification is absolutely necessary for the logic of seeing like a state to operate. Complexity is the enemy of centralized control.
And the response from minority perspectives,
Yeah.
like from the Kachin sources mentioned.
The core message seems to be that self-determination is the non-negotiable priority, almost regardless of what the Bamar majority decides to do. Whether there's a formal Bamar state or not, the goal is the right to build their own inclusive, diverse political communities on their own terms. It's fundamentally about sovereignty over their own destiny. Although we do see some worrying echoes, even within certain minority narratives, that sound quite similar to the Tatmada's own rhetoric. There's that slogan attributed to Kinyi mentioned in one source. Land swallowed by land does not destroy race, but race swallowed by race destroys race. That sentiment reveals a deep existential fear of cultural assimilation, prioritizing ethnic purity or survival, perhaps even above territorial or civic forms of unity. It's a complex and sometimes contradictory picture. Hashtag tag tag 3.3 deburmanization in action, the Rakhine model.
So if Burmanization is the dominant historical force, are we seeing active resistance, a kind of deliberate deburmanization? The sources point to the Arakan Army, AA, in Rakhine State as a prime example of this in action.
Yes, the AA provides a fascinating case study. They seem to be engaged in an alternative state-making project that goes well beyond just military campaigns. Their policies are very consciously targeted at dismantling Bamar cultural dominance in the region.
How so? What are they actually doing?
Well, the cultural edicts are quite explicit. They've reportedly instructed local theater groups, for instance, to stop using Burmese language and Burmese songs in their performances. They actively encourage the use of Rakhine language songs, or even neutral foreign languages. English, Korean, Thai pop songs are mentioned. But Burmese cultural products are being deliberately excluded or replaced.
Okay, so that's more than just promoting local culture. It's actively pushing out the dominant Bamar culture. It sounds like political engineering through culture.
It absolutely is. It's a calculated move to replace Burmese cultural hegemony with Rakhine cultural primacy. But perhaps even more significant is the kind of citizenship identity the AA leadership seems to be promoting.
How is that different?
They're talking about free citizens of Rakhine. Notice, not just Rakhine ethnic nationals. That language suggests they're trying to build a polity based on territory and citizenship rather than purely on ethnicity, aiming to unify the people living within that defined Rakhine space, whether they are ethnically Rakhine or Muslim, or belong to other smaller groups under the umbrella of Rakhine language and a shared civic identity. The ultimate goal seems to be sovereign statehood, or at least very deep autonomy. It looks like a real-world example of the nation attempting to create the state and actively displacing the central state's attempt to impose its own version of the nation.
This is all incredibly complex on the ground. Feels like we need some theoretical tools to help us make sense of this clash, the historical Bamar focus on people versus the modern need for territorial control.
Absolutely. And the frameworks are there in the sources. We can loop back to James C. Scott's idea of seeing like a state. Think about that pre-colonial Burmese king obsessively counting his 101 categories of men, not mapping land boundaries. That's a perfect pre-modern example of the state's fundamental desire for legibility.
So those 101 categories, they weren't just about bureaucratic neatness. They were the king's way of making this diverse, potentially mobile population understandable, measurable, legible, so he could tax them, conscript them, control them.
Precisely. If the state can successfully classify you, put you in a box, it can control you much more easily. And we can link this to Foucault's concept of governmentality. Modern states, and even pre-modern ones to an extent, don't just rule through brute force. They create systems of knowledge, discourses, institutions, sometimes even benign-seeming incentives like those tax breaks for pagodas that subtly encourage people to govern themselves according to the state's logic. It extends the state's reach without constant coercion.
But Scott also gives us the flip side, doesn't he? In The Art of Not Being Governed, the state demands legibility, but what if people actively choose illegibility?
Exactly. That's the story of many upland groups in Southeast Asia. Groups like the Chin, for example. Their collective identities often formed not necessarily through deep shared ancient traditions, but through a shared need to evade the control of the lowland, valley-based states, the states that were so obsessed with counting and taxing them, they actively fled state power.
How did they maintain that illegibility? How did they stay off the state spreadsheet?
By adopting practices that frustrated the state's tools. living in remote, rugged terrain that was hard for administrators to access, practicing shifting cultivation or swidden agriculture, which doesn't create the permanent taxable fields the state prefers, maybe maintaining fluid social structures. Essentially, by refusing to play the state's game of measurement and categorization, they achieved a degree of self-governance. And ironically, that very resistance to being governed helped solidify their common identity. Hashtag TAG 4.2 Geography and Identity, Comparative Perspective.
Okay, but here's the rub. While the old Burmese kings were lords of men, colonialism and then the modern nation-state system forced a complete shift in thinking. You had to start thinking about defined borders, about mapped territory. This brings in the concept of the political geobody, which is central to understanding, say, how Siam, Thailand, was mapped and defined.
That's a key concept, the geobody. It's the imagined physical territory of the nation-state, bounded by clear lines on a map. Once you have the geobody, you can't just govern people wherever they wander. You have a fixed container, and the state has to somehow manage all the diverse people inside that container. It creates a whole new set of problems.
So the modern Myanmar state is stuck trying to reconcile this historical legacy of being a lord of men with the modern reality of governing a fixed, mapped territory containing immense diversity, which leads us straight to the practical nightmare of trying to create neat ethnic federal units in places that are incredibly mixed geographically.
Exactly. Think about Yangon region or the Irrawaddy Delta, places mentioned in the sources. You could have a single classroom with Bamar, Karen, Mon, Chin, Rakhine kids all sitting together. Now, if your political model is ethnic federalism, how do you actually govern that classroom, that town, that region? Do you impose Burmese language and curriculum on everyone, which is basically Burmanization? Or do you try to let every group have its own schools, its own local administration? Which seems completely unworkable financially and logistically.
It forces a really tough choice, doesn't it, between a federalism based strictly on ethnicity, which struggles with mixed areas, and one based more on citizenship and territory, which might dilute specific ethnic identities. And given that head-on collision, we keep going back to the Bamar state creates nation versus the minority nation creates state, approaches to the sources seem pretty pessimistic about a cooperative solution. A coming together federalism where everyone willingly joins hands seems unlikely.
Highly unlikely, based on this analysis. Which leads to the conclusion that the most probable, maybe the most stable long-term outcome, if stability is even achievable, might be something like a loose confederation model. A model that acknowledges these fundamentally different paths and priorities, allowing for maximum autonomy for distinct units, maybe ethnic states, maybe regional ones, with only a very minimal connection at the center.
Okay, so if a cooperative federal union seems unlikely, and a loose confederation is maybe the more realistic, albeit potentially messy, path, we still need to grapple with the deeper consequences of this ongoing struggle, the economic and even philosophical fallout.
Yes, because the instability itself becomes a defining feature, a core problem. The sources point towards this vicious cycle, something documented in the region for centuries, really. You have constant political turmoil, the rise and fall of different ruling houses, or in modern times, different factions of the elite, different regimes. This prevents the kind of long-term stability needed for a sustained capital accumulation, for the development of a robust, independent private sector that isn't just reliant on state connections.
And without that economic stability, you get perpetual cycles of exploitation, because ruling classes never feel secure.
That's the argument. If elites never feel their position is truly stable, they have every incentive to engage in rapid, aggressive extraction and corruption. Get rich quick, basically, while the getting's good. We saw this potentially with the new elites, including some Kayapars who gained wealth rapidly after the 1988 market opening. They needed to establish their class power quickly, often by exploiting resources, knowing that the political winds could shift again at any moment. And this continuous cycle of instability and elite extraction means the general population, Bamar and minority alike, is kept in a state of socioeconomic precarity, which, of course, just fuels the grievances that keep resurfacing as ethnic conflict or political unrest.
It's like a feedback loop. The instability prevents economic progress, the lack of progress fuels grievances, the grievances fuel conflict, and the conflict ensures continued instability. It keeps the whole system stuck. Hashtag tag 5.3, the existential burden of belonging. Outro buildup.
And beneath all the politics and economics, this deep dive really forces us to confront what you might call the existential burden of belonging, or perhaps not belonging. The sources bring in some really profound philosophical framing here, drawing even on Buddhist texts like the Dhammacakka Sutta. It reminds us, Pihehi vipayogo dukkho,
Which means
separation from the loved is suffering. The pain we feel when we lose something or someone dear, that's a universal human experience.
Okay, but the sources seem more focused on the flip side of that, don't they, in the context of Myanmar's union?
Exactly. They highlight the reverse concept, apiehi sampayogo duko, which translates to association with the unloved is suffering. And that sentiment seems to capture the profound political and philosophical weight carried by many ethnic groups in Myanmar. This feeling of being forced into an unwanted union, perpetually tied to a central power, the Bamar-dominated state that they perceive as having historically oppressed or tried to assimilate them. For many, the union isn't a cherished ideal, it's felt as a source of ongoing suffering, like a forced marriage, perhaps.
So if association with the unloved is suffering, then the actions we see, like the de-Burmanization efforts by the Iraqi army, they're fundamentally about trying to end that suffering by seeking separation, seeking a divorce from that central state.
That's one way to interpret the deep motivation, yes. It's an attempt to escape that existential burden. And this pressure, this desire to end the suffering of forced association, it helps explain the intensity, the sheer rawness of the conflict. In its most extreme, most tragic manifestations, this desperation can lead to unthinkable acts. The sources draw an analogy, for instance, to the Balinese historical practice of puputan.
Mass ritual suicide.
Yes, where entire royal courts chose mass suicide rather than submit to Dutch colonial rule.
Yeah.
They essentially decided that association with the unloved, submission to the colonizer, was a fate literally worse than death. It's a horrifying historical example, but it underscores the potential spiritual and existential cost of enforced political union when it's perceived as fundamentally illegitimate or oppressive. Hashtag Hag Outro.
Wow. We have certainly covered a huge amount of ground today. We've gone from the pre-colonial lord of men governing through counting people, through the complex hybrid reality of the Kayapars, who often became the unlikely enforcers of an assimilationist state.
We've really drilled down into that fundamental collision between two different kinds of nationalism.
Right.
The nation creates state idea driving many minority aspirations versus the state creates nation logic inherent in the Bamar-centric view. And we've looked at contemporary examples like the Arakan Army that suggest new models of de-Burmanization and alternative state-making might be emerging.
It leaves us with this core conflict for Myanmar, which seems as much philosophical and cultural as it is political. Is the future going to be built on some kind of genuine coming together, a model that truly respects these very different historical paths and identities? Or will the gravitational pull of the centralized state, the legacy of Burmanization, continue to push an assimilationist project that guarantees, for many, that association with the unloved is suffering?
It makes you think about that concept mentioned in the sources, the Pakarawasa rain, this mythical selective rain that supposedly only falls on those who truly desire it. Can Myanmar ever achieve a lasting unity based purely on that kind of shared selective desire? Or is the weight of history, the inertia of the centralized state, just too immense? Perhaps the future is inevitably destined to be some form of loose, maybe perpetually uneasy confederation. That's the profound question, the challenge left for the political actors on all sides, and for you, the listener, as you continue to follow and analyze this incredibly complex situation.